everyone is ready for lunch, but we still have one talk before. It's a shorter one, so that's good news, maybe. On the other side, it's also a very interesting one. This lightning talk will give you a bit of insight in Solid, a specification that lets people store their data securely in decentralized data stores. Wow! So for someone who is not very technical, it's a hell of a sentence. But Frederick Bousson will guide you through this topic. As you all heard by Peter this morning, he's very ancient in Ordina bytes and certificates in the join editions. He's a solution architect working for JWorks. Gave already a lot of presentations on the previous joint editions and loves to explore new technologies and deep dive in the complexity of code. So, Frederick, I will give you the floor.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Okay, so I will talk a bit about Solid now. I have 15 slides and 15 minutes, so I'm going to go quickly through them. If you want more information, don't feel free to ask. So Solid actually stands for social linked data. We'll dive deeper into that. I'm Frederick, and I'm the person keeping you from lunch, so I'll keep it as short as possible. We'll quickly go over what social linked data actually is, give an overview of why you would want to use it, and actually present also a use case of Solid, how it could actually be used in the real world. Okay, Solid, social linked data. Who is on the social platform Facebook? Who is still on that? Yeah, okay. Who's actually still using it? Yeah, okay, yeah. There's a lot less people. That's probably also because you don't really know what's happening to your data. Sometimes you feel quite uncomfortable. Who heard about the Cambridge Analytica scandal? Yeah. So it's not always quite clear what's happening to your own personal data and who is using it for what purposes. So that's not a very comfortable feeling. But your personal data is spread out everywhere across the web. And because that's not having your data with big companies like Facebook, that's not a happy place for your data to live. So that's why Sir Tim Berners-Lee came up with the idea of Solid, social linked data, to have an answer to that, to actually gain back ownership of your own data. Solid, it will help you with your personal data web. So what's the problem? I'll explain it giving a quite simple example. Your address. Who knows where you live? The government should know where you live. But the problem is a lot of other organizations like banks, like shops, like whatever, also would like to know where you live. And that means you duplicate your data across a lot of different systems. And once it's duplicated, you don't have any control of that data anymore. It's there, it's out there, you don't know who actually has it, who resells it, where it's going, if it's still up to date or not. And that's quite a big problem. And that's something that Solid would like to solve. And that you, instead of duplicating your data, that you actually connect all the dots of your data. Yeah. Let's talk about data ownership. There's two kinds of data that Solid kinds of sees. Data of you and data about you. If you're, for example, in a social media context, data of you could be I've liked something, I've written a comment, I've posted a picture. That's data that I own and I can freely manipulate and modify. That's data of me. Data about you is data that has something to do with me, but I'm not at liberty to modify that data. For example, my address. I can't just modify my address to say something else, so that way all my bills will end up at a different address. That's not something that you would want. Same for my bank account. Would be really good that that's data of me, how much money I have on my bank account. Would be really fun to add some extra zeros there somewhere, but that's not something you should be able to do. So that's data of you, data about you, and data can be everywhere. And the goal of Solid is to link all of that data. Here you see kind of basic Solid architecture, where you would have all kinds of parties like the government, supermarket or whatever. They all run their own Solid server. And it's kind of a database service, and in that solid server, you have the ability to have your own personal data pod. The solid server is a pod store, multiple pods. You have your own pod. Basically, it's like your own personal data vault, which has all of your personal data, and Solid will help you govern that data. It will help you, but we'll see that later on, grant access to other parties to read your data. They will also then have updates, and you'll also be able to cut the connection with other parties if you want. What kind of benefits do you have using this kind of system of sharing the data? You have more control and transparency. Control means my address is stored in a pod in a solid server hosted by the government. I'm able to decide who actually gets to read that data. And also I have the added benefit of being able to reuse that data across all of other kinds of different platforms. You don't have to manually enter your address across all of those different kinds of web shops. It's just there. You just have to link it. And also a nice benefit is that you have the ability now to stop other organizations from using your data. You have the ability to say, okay, you can't use this data anymore, and they'll have to destroy it. You also get more transparency. You can see where the dots are connected. You create your own personal data space across all the different Solid servers. You know which Solid servers have your information, and you can see using a data browser how the links are made across your data. And you see how it's being used and for what purposes, how it's handled and stored. That's from a personal human perspective. How is it from an organizational or enterprise perspective? Well, personal data comes at a certain cost. It comes at a certain cost of capturing and updating that information. Your bank probably wants to know where you live, but what happens when you move? How will they be sure that they still have the correct information? So sometimes they will need to verify all of their personal information to see if it's still relevant. Otherwise, you will have degraded information, and that's quite useful to work with, useless to work with. Personal information also has a certain cost to store it because it's quite risky data. You need to be quite aware of how you store that data. And there's also a certain cost of using certain data. You need to be able to quickly have access to certain data, and that's not always possible. And there's also risks involved with personal data. Like I said before, the risk of poor data quality. If you're working your personal data and it's poor quality, then your processes will not run as smoothly as they should. There's also a risk of data breaches. When you're storing personal data, you have a data breach, there's a big chance of you ending up in the evening news, like, oh, there's another data breach. That's not something you want, and there's also like big fines linked to that. Okay, so let's talk a bit about open link data. That's something that exists quite some time, but I think OLED doesn't sound as good as solid, so I think there's a bit of branding that's not good. So, like I explained earlier, Solid is just a specification of data pods, data vaults. You can put anything in your data vaults, anything at all. But that then becomes a bit of a trash can. You can just dump any kind of information into that pod. So there are technologies in the semantic web context that will help you describe your data. Typically use a resource description framework and RDF for that. Data is then typically described in triples, triple between the subject, predicate, and object. You see a simple example on the right side, subject, predicate, object. Bob, subject, knows, predicate, object is John. Bob knows John. That's a simple way of linking things to each other and adding meaning to it. At the bottom right, you see an example of how data in a solid pod, of what it could look like. You have something called a vocabulaire. You have certain standards. Here you have a certain way of describing music. As you can imagine with standards, everybody can make their own standard, so that's also a bit difficult regarding interoperability. But here, for example, you have a way of describing music. we have a way of identifying the artist, namely Nas. And then here you can describe, for example, an album. You say this album is made by a certain artist, and this album is published by a record label. You can make a lot of statements. You can link a lot of data together. And that's how you use open linked data, and that's the information that you will put in your pod. But again, the difficulty is which kind of standards will you use to actually model the data. And you can imagine everybody wants to use their own standards. Yeah. Why open linked data? At Ordina, we've already been doing a lot of open linked data. This is not quite my area of expertise, but it's quite interesting what the use cases are. If you have a lot of data and it's labeled, you understand the data, you can do quite interesting stuff with AI. Imagine all of those data sets, even your personal data sets, being modeled in open linked data and then being able to be consumed by an AI. That's an interesting but scary opportunity there. Yeah. But let's make it a bit more concrete. This is an example of an architecture that uses solid technology. Yeah. I'll quickly explain the use case. If I want to have a loan, I will need to go to the bank. I will need to provide them my, how do you say it, loan fiches? My pay slips. I will need to provide them my pay slips. There is fraud. It's known that people do fraud on their pay slips. They modify it a bit to get their loan granted. So as a bank, I want to be sure that the payslip, the information that I get, is coming from a credible source. And I would really like to have everything automated. But payslip information is quite personal information. You just don't want that easily accessible and spread around. So what you see here is a way of automating the process of approving or giving a loan. What you see here are three major players in the solid ecosystem. You have the producer, the custodian, and the consumer. Imagine that the RSZ, that's a government instance which has all of your pay information. They're able to put that pay information into a solid server, into your personal pod on a solid server. What they would do is they would just invoke a certain API with your information about your pay information, and that would then transform it into an RDF format, and that would then be stored into your personal pod. You need someone to host solid servers. And luck has it that the Flemish government has created the Vlaams Data Nutsbedrijf, which is their purpose. They have solid infrastructure, and you can use that to store personal information. So they are the data custodian. They will make sure that your personal information is stored on safe infrastructure, and that everything works as it should work. So what we have done now is we've published your pay information into your solid pod. And then what you will do, this is you want a loan, so you will go to the loan simulator app of your bank. And there you will say, okay, I want a loan. And then in the app, you will be requested, the bank will request access to your pod, to specifically your loan information. And at that time, you explicitly grant consent on your personal data. That's the whole idea. You grant your consent so they can read it. If you're not happy with that bank, you can also remove that consent. So at that time, you're in the app. The bank is a consumer. They ask to read your pod, and the custodian, for example, has the ability to have a list of web identities of known parties, for example, the bank. So they're a trusted source. The bank is able to read personal private information from a trusted source, and you're able to provide that information again to also other trusted whitelisted sources. So this is the flow how you could use Solid to expose your personal data. And this is already coming this summer. The slides are a bit older, but this is already happening. So the Flemish government already, for example, I think publishes your school degrees, your diplomas. They're already available in Solid, so you're able to share that already. And you can imagine a lot of other use cases that you can have to share your data. You could do this as well via APIs, but then you have less richness in declaring what your data is, so it's less, you can less explore it. The ability to describe your data is quite nice and quite rich. And if you just have APIs, the mechanism of giving the consent and revoking access is also not part of a standard API. So what Solid tries to do, it's about the data, but more about the life cycle of the data. Who gets to read it? How long do they get to read it? Do they get updates or not? Yeah. I don't think I have time for a demo. I was just going to show what the app could look like, but I've explained that. So it's already here, Solid. You see Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web. So it's quite a big name that's linked to Solid. And Flanders tries to be front runner in Solid technology because, like I said, it was first imagined to be used in a social context, but then enterprises and governments also see a lot of benefits of using that kind of technology. Because, for example, there's a new European law that governments can only ask data once for its civilians. So that means they have a lot of duplication across different government branches. They can't have that anymore. So if you have like a way of decentralizing, storing it, you get a lot of benefits there. So that's my lightning talk regarding Solid. Are there any questions? It's clear? Yeah. Yes.
When you revoke a permission,
yeah.
What's stopping the company that has access to your data?
Nothing.
Have made a copy and use that.
Yeah, let me repeat the question. If you've granted access to a certain company and then you revoke your access for that company, what's stopping them from keeping the data? Well, they can always make a copy, yeah? That's true. But typically, they don't want to make copies. Because, like I said, if you make a copy of personal data, you have the GDPR law, which kind of protects you. So probably if there are audits on that company and say, hey, this data, you shouldn't have this data because it's available via Solid, then they probably would get fines. And typically, like I said, as a company, you don't want to have a copy of that data because then it might become stale. So if you're always reading from the source, like for example, my address is always stored at the government, I'm always reading from the source, so I know that my data is up to date. But I can imagine some malafide companies, they just want to have the data and then say bye. But I think laws and regulations and auditing would probably solve that problem. Solid is in its early steps, so I think that the legal part of everything also still needs to be explored a bit more. Solid itself is an interesting product to think about, but you can see that the maturity is also still needs to grow a bit. Yeah, but a good question indeed. Yeah.
An architecture, a product?
Yeah.
A standard?
It's a concept and it's also a product. You can get the open source version, you can play around with it, but there's also a company called Inrupt which has a Solid enterprise server. So the enterprise server basically allows you to run your Solid server, and what's basically underneath is open web standards. I think Solid is built using Node.js and a Postgres database, some API management, and some OAuth, whatever stuff, authentication. So it's basically just a standard web application, but that handles that creates personal data spaces for you. So it is a product, and it could be a product, but it's more like a specification or a standard on how data could be shared. Yeah,
it's a private company that is now being used by the Flemish company.
I don't know what they're using, but it's an open standard. It's basically like J2EE.
Yeah.
It's a standard. You can build your own application server. Best one wins. Everybody gets to implement the spec, basically. Yeah. But at the moment, it's only one company who does it, the company of Sir Tim Berners-Lee. So, yeah.
It looks to me that it's something that needs to be pushed by governments or
But they're
controlled by governments?
yeah, but they're the big party demanding it, because they have a lot of data duplication as well, and they are custodians of a lot of data, and they can facilitate a lot of business processes. The banks, for example, really want a lot of data. For example, if you have to buy a house, you have to give the EPC certificate to your bank. And that's also a big hassle to get the document, but the bank can't actually keep the document. And with this, you can use the data to do the processing, to do the process, and then you don't need the data anymore. Yeah.
I think we now have something like Bank with the data.
Yes, yeah, but
Like that, but
yeah, it's a bit like that, but it's another way of managing the life cycle of your data. Yeah. Okay, sorry. Yeah.
Is it a kind of digital identification? Like sometimes we also use "it's me." Is it something like that, or?
It's me could be used together with it, because it's me just says I am this is my identity. There are multiple ways to do digital identities, but once you say it's me, you're able to grant other parties who are also known access to certain data. So you need indeed something to identify yourself, to give access to certain part of your pods to another known party. Like here, you have the concept in Solid of web identities, of known identities. Yeah, they could come from anywhere.
It's like I meant when you log in with the It's Me app.
Yeah.
It uses this principle or not?
No. But you could use It's Me to authenticate against a Solid server, for example. You could say the Solid server uses It's Me as authentication, and then you're granted access to your pod. Yeah.
Is the data the data synced between pods?
You could do that. Yeah, that's one of the mechanisms that you can indeed sync the data.
If you change your mail address, in the government pod, for example, and like for example, there is a case to supermarkets. So
yeah.
So you have to only change your mail address in the government, in the government pod, for example, and will be automatically synced.
Yeah, indeed.
Pods.
Yeah, that's also one mechanism of using it, that the government pushes everybody who wants an update, they automatically get an update pushed to your pod, which lives at another Solid server. Yeah. Okay.
If an organization creates a pod with data about me, do they have to notify me that there is
Probably.
a pod with data about me, and how will I get that notification? Will there be apps coming soon?
Yeah, well, the idea is that you have a data browser app which should link to all of your known Solid servers. But typically, I think the government, I still need to check that. For example, they've published all of your school diplomas already in a pod. I don't think we were notified of that. So I think there are still some things to think about the process, but you're the one who's only able to view it and only able to give access to it. So if you will look at my burger profile, I think you should be able to navigate to that. But that's a good question. My supermarket has a lot of information about me, like what I buy, my shopping history. Yeah, I don't have access to that at the moment. They maybe have an app, but I don't really have access or any insight and that's something that Solid tries to solve, but we're not there yet. And I think the government at the moment is trying to make some use cases to inspire companies to use that way of working with personal data. Yeah.
That does mean that whoever manages that data browser has access to all data.
The data browser, you authenticate with your identity to that data browser, and then you connect to your pods on the Solid servers. Maybe.
But if I'm going to a supermarket, I don't need to authenticate. So the supermarket has my data linked to my name. So if there's a centralized thing that is able to query that data.
But that's the idea. There's no centralized thing. Every pod is secure by itself.
Security issues.
Yes, yeah, because the data custodian who hosts the data on their own infrastructure, they might have access to everything.
Yeah.
But that should be solved again by the people implementing the solid server specification, that everything is nicely secure and separated. Yeah? Because a data custodian, you trust them in a certain way. You trust your bank not to modify your personal data or look into your personal data as well. Yeah. Yes. It's indeed. Okay. Any other questions? Oh. Okay, then thank you for your attention.